Even though your lens might say it goes to 1.8 or 1.4 or even 1.2, that doesn't mean you should always shoot with the widest aperture possible. And here's why. Sharpness of the lens suffers at both ends of the aperture. So whether you're shooting wide open at 1.2 or closed all the way down at f22, both of those settings are not going to be optimal in terms of sharpness. They control how much light is hitting the sensor and what your depth of field looks like. But if you're going for sharpness, which most of the time we want our images to be clear and visible and not suffer from any kind of weird lens aberrations, you're going to want to shoot at something in between. Something more like f2.8 or f4 or even 5.6 in some cases, especially if you're using a full frame camera. Most of the time, you want things in focus. Unless you're going for a very stylized look, it's probably best to stay away from the ends of the aperture on the lens. So if you want that shallow depth of field look, but you're still trying to maintain total image quality, you're going to want to shoot at like f2 or 2.8. That's what I do on the majority of my work. I stop down the lens just a little bit. I like the shallow depth of field look. I don't want it to be too sharp with everything in focus. But when you're shooting wide open, you're going to have much less sharpness. It's going to be a more creamy, dreamy look. And you might not notice it at first, especially looking at the camera LCD, but when you take it back into your editing program, whether it's Photoshop or Premiere or whatever, whether it's video or photo, you're going to see that your sharpness just isn't there. And another thing is you have a lot less depth of field to play with. Your depth of field of what's actually in focus. You have a razor thin depth of field, and it's going to be very hard. It's typically like someone's eye that you want in focus, or maybe it's just the subject of your frame. But keeping that in focus is going to be very, very challenging on a full frame camera shooting at 1.4 or 1.8. A lot of people do it because they think that the shallow depth of field gives it a much more rich or cinematic look. But when you watch most films or TV shows or look at professional imagery, a lot of times it's not a super shallow depth of field. That's just something that's been built up in our minds because over the years we've associated shallow depth of field with high-end productions, the people who could afford the large sensor cameras. But now that that's available, more people need to realize that you don't need to shoot wide open. You've got much less sharpness to play with, and you've got practically no depth of field, so your subject is very hard to keep in focus, and your backgrounds and foregrounds are just blurred to the extreme, to where on a small LCD, when everything's shrunk down, you can tell what it is, but blown up, it's just color blobs. So be really careful when you're shooting. I know it's tempting, especially if you have a cool lens that can go to 1.2 or even 1.0 in some cases, but usually that's not going to give you the best results. Me personally, I like it to be sharp, so I always want to stop down just a little bit and maybe bump your ISO or, play with your shutter speed or, use NDs or don't use NDs. Whatever it's going to do to get you to that point where you're shooting around, f2, 2.8, or f4. That's going to be a sweet spot. There's people who even, shoot at f8, especially for like photography when sometimes you want more in focus, f8, f11, f16. Those aperture values are probably more popular in photography, certainly some types of photography, but also as video as well. But if you're going for the shallow depth of field look, I'd recommend something like f2.8, unless the lens maxes out at f2.8. If that's as wide as the aperture goes, then you want to stop down from there too, because every lens, they give you a little bit extra. They let you push it a little bit farther than that's optimal, just so you get that extra stop of light, if you're shooting in low light or something. If you're shooting in low light, these rules don't really apply. But if you have plenty of light, stop down on the lens just a little bit, a stop or two, so you can keep everything razor sharp and you can still keep that shallow depth of field. You'll lose it a little bit, but your overall image sharpness will more than make up for it because you won't have to worry about weird chromatic aberrations or things not being in focus when they should be. So just keep that in mind next time you're on a shoot.